This lecture review video focuses on the Age of Jackson, which we can date from 1824 to 1844. This time period, along with the rest of the decades before the American Civil War, are often called the antebellum period, roughly from the early Republic all the way to 1861. These are very formative years for the United States, a period of great growth and expansion, and many of its democratic institutions are also expanded and grow during this time. Very important and famous visitor to the United States during the antebellum period was Alexis de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville was a French citizen, and he famously wrote Democracy in America, in which he recorded his observations regarding democratic institutions in the United States, the rampant population growth, and also the emphasis on religion and the attendance to church in the United States. The antebellum period is very famous for the explosion, the religious awakening known as the Second Great Awakening. We can divide the Second Great Awakening into two strains of Christianity. The first is Enlightenment Christianity. This version of Christianity particularly stems from the Age of Reason or the European Enlightenment of the 18th century, which emphasized man's reason, man's ability to be good and achieve good things, and also the distance of God, particularly deism, that viewed God as a creator, but a detached creator, and rejected many of the miracles and stories of the Bible that emphasize the divinity of Jesus and also his resurrection and atonement for sins. A couple prominent leaders in the enlightened Christian movement of the United States would include Thomas Paine, whose most famous pamphlet, of course, was Common Sense, published in January of 1776, which led to the Declaration of Independence. But another significant pamphlet was The Age of Reason, in which he criticized traditional Christian theology and emphasized man's ability to comprehend the universe and to comprehend truth and to form truth, famously declaring that his mind was his church. Thomas Jefferson also fits conveniently into this strain of Christianity we can identify as enlightened. Jefferson rejected traditional Christian theology and isolated the stories from the Gospels in the Bible that he believed to be true by excluding the miracles of Jesus, any references to a virgin birth, and also his resurrection, and privately published this collection of stories known as The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. Very significant leader also in Enlightenment Christianity in the United States was William Ellery Channing. Channing was a Boston pastor and is often credited with developing Unitarianism in the United States. He often preached from what is today Arlington Street Church in Boston, and he emphasized the unity of God, rejected the concept of the Trinity of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, also rejected the idea of a substitutionary atonement of Jesus dying for people's sins, and emphasized traditional Unitarian doctrine. This monument outside of his church declared he breathed into theology a human spirit and proclaimed anew the divinity of man. These ideas of Enlightenment Christianity, and particularly Unitarianism, we can see eventually morph into what we can identify as New England Transcendentalism, which emphasized the spiritual unity of all forms of being, with God, man, and nature all sharing a universal oversoul. There are heavy influences from Hindu thinking in the development of American Transcendentalism. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Bronson Alcott, and Margaret Fuller, many of them living in Concord, Massachusetts, were very significant leaders in Transcendentalism. Enlightened Christianity takes particular hold in New England and comes to predominate many of those old Puritan congregational churches that had been established in the colonial period. The exception in the city of Boston, which has now become dominated by Unitarian and Universalist churches, is Park Street Church, which holds on to a traditional Trinitarian view of God and also an evangelical gospel. The second and other significant strain in Second Great Awakening Christianity is evangelicalism. Evangelical Christianity emphasizes a belief in God and the traditional Trinity, and also a belief that Jesus died on the cross to forgive people of sins, and those that put their faith in him will be forgiven of their sins and be granted heaven. The Second Great Awakening has similarities with the First Great Awakening, but is certainly different in many accounts. The Second Great Awakening predominates in what was the West of the early 19th century and is characterized by these outdoor large camp meetings in which thousands of people would come together to hear open-air preaching, often sleeping in tents and gatherings for several days at these camp meetings. The most famous and largest one occurs first at Cane Ridge, Kentucky, in this meeting house, which is still located on the same site. The Second Great Awakening in evangelicalism is also characterized by circuit riders, which were traveling preachers who would travel hundreds and even thousands of miles up and down, particularly the Appalachian Mountains, preaching to remote settlers and farms along the way. Second Great Awakening also witnesses an explosion of music and hymn singing and the composition of new hymns, and also sees a move towards extemporaneous preaching, which is preaching without notes and allowing the Spirit to lead what you preach. And we also see the introduction of what is originally called the anxious bench, in which modern observers would probably recognize today as an altar call, in which those who are anxious for the state of their souls and anxious for the forgiveness of sins could come down to the front of the meeting hall and kneel and pray and also receive prayer and guarantee of forgiveness of their sins. Thus, we can compare the First and Second Great Awakenings with this chart. George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, of course, were very significant leaders of the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening saw an explosion of members for the Presbyterian, Congregational, and Anglican churches. It tended to be more intellectual, although with emotional displays in the event of conversion. It was represented and predominated by Calvinist theology, and many new lights, or those who supported the revivals, created new colleges, including Princeton, Brown, and Rutgers. It challenged traditional authority and was also characterized by some itinerant preachers, particularly George Whitefield. The Second Great Awakening, the premier leader was probably Charles Finney for his introduction of new measures, which include calling out sin from the pulpit of members in the audience, the introduction of the anxious bench, and also characterized by extemporaneous preaching. Baptists, Methodists, and other new denominations see an explosion in their membership during the Second Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening is significantly more emotional than the First Great Awakening and is characterized by Arminian theology, which promoted the idea that man can choose God and decide whether or not he will be saved and accept the atonement of Jesus. There is also a strong strain of postmillennialism in many of the Second Great Awakening preachers, and a belief that very soon the world was coming to an end. Among the most famous itinerant preachers would include Francis Asbury, who is known for traveling thousands of miles throughout the American West, particularly in Tennessee and Kentucky and up to upstate New York. He is one of the premier founders of American Methodism. Also, Peter Cartwright, another Methodist, whose personal autobiography, the autobiography of Peter Cartwright, the Backwoods Preacher, recounted his dramatic conversion. He was famous for his folksy sayings and for his down-to-earth preaching, and was one of the most popular and well-known preachers in antebellum America. Also, Lorenzo Dow, much more charismatic preacher who is famous for traveling throughout the frontier, was a strong critic of traditional Calvinist theology and promoted the idea that man can choose to be saved or not, and is urgent that indeed he does choose to be saved. Other emerging denominations besides the Baptists and the Methodists in the frontier America include the Restoration Movement, which was a union of two denominations, the Disciples of Christ, founded by Alexander Campbell, and the Christians, founded by Barton Stone. The Restoration Movement, which combined these two things, envisioned restoring the primitive New Testament church. Therefore, the laity and clergy were considered equal. The individual conscience is greater than the collective will. Rejected historical learned theology in favor of inquiry and innovation, and every believer can understand and interpret the New Testament individually. A very significant African American congregation also emerges in the early 19th century, founded by Richard Allen, particularly in the city of Philadelphia, which was the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which stemmed from the Methodist Church, a much more charismatic denomination, but becomes the largest African American denomination in the United States. The premier leader of the Second Great Awakening, indeed, was Charles Finney. Charles Finney had a background as a Presbyterian and as a lawyer, but certainly departs from that profession and that form of theology for his leadership in the Second Great Awakening. Charles Finney viewed a revival not as a miraculous display of the Holy Spirit, but rather something that can be planned and something that can be scheduled and accomplished if the right means are put into effect. He promoted the idea of perfectionist sanctification, in which individuals could be perfected and overcome sin. Also, the idea of a second blessing of the Holy Spirit. And his ideas of perfectionism are very significant and spread throughout the American West. His lectures on revivals of religion essentially asserted that one could start a revival upon their call, upon their schedule, simply by following the means that he's prescribed. Finney enjoys his greatest success, particularly in upstate and western New York. This is still a very much a frontier area with remote settlements. But the largest revival he conducts and leads occurs in Rochester, New York in 1830 and 1831, in which shopkeepers and dock workers shut down the city for several days while Finney is preaching, and large revivals break out in Rochester, particularly in the shopkeepers, masters, and apprentices in that year. Finney was also the founder of Oberlin College in Ohio for the training of ministers in the new measures, including the anxious bench, extemporaneous preaching, and also circuit riding. Lyman Beecher was also a very significant early 19th century minister. He was famous for his own ministry, which begins in Cincinnati, but he was also very famous for his children. He has 13 children. Many of them become very successful as reformers and ministers. His son, Henry Ward Beecher, becomes the most famous preacher in late 19th century America, mid and late 19th century America. And of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe will be famous for her writing of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the 1850s. Generally, the Second Great Awakening, characterized by the explosion of numbers for the Methodists and the Baptists, is the premier revival of the early 19th century. But there are critics of the Second Great Awakening, include Asahel Nettleton. Nettleton was a Reformed Presbyterian, and Nettleton criticized the new measures of Charles Finney, claiming that these revivals were simply emotional displays and people were put under pressure in order to convert to Christianity, and they were not genuine conversions. And therefore, Nettleton and Finney met in the New Lebanon Conference in 1827 in an effort to resolve their differences. Particularly issues of debate were calling out sin, the anxious bench, repetitive singing for effect, and the urging of physical displays to demonstrate conversion. However, the two sides are really unable to reconcile. Although they believe in the primacy of the gospel, they are not able to reconcile their theology and also their means as a result of this conference. Another significant critic of Finney's new measures include the Princeton theology professor, Charles Hodge. Hodge keeps Princeton University, and particularly its divinity school, committed to Reformed theology, to Calvinist theology, amidst an explosion of Arminian theology in the Second Great Awakening. He's known as a prolific writer and a premier leader of the Reformed tradition in 19th century America. Besides Enlightenment Christianity, which really takes over much of the New England churches in the early 19th century, Evangelical Christianity was the largest religious revival movement in the 19th century, but there is also a smaller strain of religious revival we can identify and call religious radicalism. These are groups and sects and leaders that were particularly out of the mainstream, had small followers, but certainly attracted a lot of attention in the 19th century. Among these, we could include William Miller, who was a upstate New York preacher, and through his study of the scriptures, he concluded that Jesus was returning in 1843, that the second coming was occurring on this date. Miller developed many elaborate charts studying the books of Daniel and Revelation in the Bible and identified this key year as 1843. After many of his followers, known as the Millerites, sold their homes and farms and waited for the return of Jesus on this date, there was the great disappointment in which Jesus did not return. And so he recalculated, and Miller concluded that the year that Jesus was to return was 1844. And therefore they awaited again for the return of Jesus in that year. And of course, Jesus did not return. So this leads to what is known as the Great Disappointment, the failure of this apocalyptic expectation. The Millerites convene in Albany, New York, conducting the Albany Conference in 1845, deciding where to go forward. Out of this conference emerges several different groups, including the Christadelphians, also the Advent Christian movement, also the Charles Taze Russell Bible students, who will eventually become the Jehovah's Witnesses, and also the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Seventh-day Adventist Church was founded in large part through the efforts of Ellen G. White. Ellen G. White claimed that she was a modern prophet and identified several miracles that she had performed to prove that she was a prophet. She wrote several books advocating for modern health practices, also the return of Jesus imminently, and also the restoration of the Jewish Sabbath day of Saturday should be the traditional Christian Sabbath. We also see much more extreme groups among these religious radicals, including the Kingdom of Matthias, with two very charismatic prophets, Elijah the Tishbite and Prophet Matthias, leading this group. This group was small in numbers, only several dozen, lived in New York, and they practiced everything from communal marriage to an extreme apocalypticism and also communal living. Out of this group emerges the famous African-American female poet Sojourner Truth. Among the other religious radicals of 19th century America include Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was born in Vermont and then grew up on a farm in New York. There are many accusations of bankruptcy and counterfeiting money within his family. Joseph Smith was known for his wild imagination. And then he reports that the angel Moroni appeared to him in the woods in New York and offered him golden plates of a new set of scriptures and proclaimed him to be the new prophet. So using seer stones that Smith had discovered or claimed to have discovered in upstate New York and viewing through his hat, Smith is able to decipher the golden plates the angels gave him, and this creates the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is an additional testament added to the Bible, which argues that there were the early civilizations in the Americas that fought each other, and that these civilizations were originally converted by the resurrected Jesus who appeared to them. But eventually these civilizations collapsed. And Smith also asserts that the original Garden of Eden was located in Davis County, Missouri. Therefore, Mormons believe that Jesus will return again, and that it's important to become a member of the Mormon Church, be baptized into the Mormon Church. And originally they endorsed polygamy, polygamous marriages, and part of that baptism in which they wear their holy underwear, eventually they would be confirmed into the church, and eventually the goal, particularly for the men, are to become gods themselves, in which they would reign over a celestial planet, have multiple wives, and bear many children. Smith's ideas are, of course, very radical for antebellum America. At one point, he is attacked and tarred and feathered, and he is charged with counterfeiting and polygamy in the Midwest. And so he is imprisoned in Carthage, Illinois, in the local jail, and a mob attacks the jail, resulting with Smith being shot in his prison cell, where he is still buried today in Nauvoo, Illinois. As a result of Smith's death, the Mormon movement is quite disorganized and collapses until the very capable leadership of Brigham Young. Brigham Young brings a new vitality and life to the Mormon movement. Whereas the Mormons could have fallen apart at this point, Brigham Young effectively organizes them and proclaims himself to be the new prophet and leads them on the Great Mormon Trek in 1846, traveling to the west until they originally settle on the banks of the Great Salt Lake in what is today modern Utah. In this settlement in Salt Lake, in the establishment of the city there, the Mormons create their own community, practice polygamous marriage, bear many children, also become very economically successful, and then their way of life does not change until Utah is formed into a state, annexed into the United States as an official state in 1876. Other radical leaders of the time include Jemima Wilkinson. Jemima Wilkinson had a vision in which she proclaimed that she is no longer female, that she was neither male or female, but rather called herself the personal universal friend, and she was the creator of a new Quaker sect known as the Society of Universal Friends. Also, Mother Ann Lee, who is the founder of the Shakers. Part and parcel of the Shaker movement was a rejection of sexual relations, even between husbands and wives, and as a result, with the lack of children being born in the movement eventually dies out in late 19th century America. There's also a strong movement of spiritualism in 19th century America, which included things like Ouija boards and also seances, mediums, speaking to the dead, tarot cards, and so forth. Eventually, spiritualism will also attract the attention of Mary Todd Lincoln, who will use seances in an effort to communicate with her dead son Willie and eventually her dead husband Abraham Lincoln. Out of all of these revival movements, Enlightenment Christianity, evangelical Christianity, and also radical Christianity in antebellum America, we see a new trend towards reform, new efforts to reform the United States. These reform movements particularly stem from the postmillennialism, which was very popular in 19th century America. Postmillennialism asserts the idea that a 1,000-year reign of Christ will occur when the world is perfect. It is optimistic. It is belief that the world is constantly getting better. And so if we can create the kingdom of God on earth, then eventually we will establish the millennium, and then Jesus will return, and it'll lead to the end of the world. So this postmillennial theology is very important for inspiring many reform movements of the antebellum period. Among these reform movements, we see a new attention to education, particularly through the efforts of Horace Mann, who is the Secretary of Massachusetts Education, who emphasized requiring public school for all children, mandating their attendance, and a new curriculum that was particularly based on his Unitarian theology and rejected Puritan theology. And so we can see the results of his efforts in Massachusetts with the expansion of public schools, including kindergarten programs, also public high schools, and also normal schools, which were created for the training of teachers. Education is very important early post-antebellum reform movement. We also see intention reform in education through the efforts of William McGuffey, who created his famous McGuffey Readers. These are earliest books for training children how to read and become very popular in antebellum America. We see a reform movement directed towards American women in the antebellum period, through particularly through the efforts of famous suffragettes, including Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony. Elizabeth Blackwell, although English, was the first female doctor in the United States. Lucy Stone was famous for not taking her husband's last name, a upon her marriage, and Amelia Bloomer was famous for the development of bloomer pants as opposed to long skirts and dresses required of women at the time. Many American women and some men come together at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention. At the convention, they draft what they call the Declaration of Sentiments. This document essentially was a rewriting of the Declaration of Independence, which asserted that all men and women are created equal, and asserted the rights of women, particularly the right to vote. Sometimes the antebellum women's rights movement is identified as first wave feminism. If we call it first wave feminism, we can see that the prime concerns of reforming women, feminists of this time period, were focused on such things as more liberal divorce laws, as often husbands were allowed to initiate a divorce, but not women. Also, a reform of property rights in the sense that women would be allowed to inherit their husband's property upon their husband's death. And also the right of women to testify on juries, become part of juries, and also testify in court. But the primary reform that many women's rights activists were seeking at this time were the right to vote, what becomes known as suffrage, which of course will not be granted until the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Also, a very large reform movement in antebellum America was the temperance movement. There's large-scale consumption of alcohol in antebellum America, and so many call for a movement to reduce or even eliminate such drastic alcohol consumption in the United States. Women particularly play a prominent role in advocating for the temperance movement, as they are often the target of drunk husbands who spend their weekly paychecks at the saloon and leave nothing for the provision of their wives and children. And so there's much propaganda, a lot of literature and pamphlets that are produced, assemblies and speeches and conventions in 19th century America advocating for the reduction or the abolition of alcohol in the United States. We have the formation of the American Temperance Society in 1826, the Washingtonian Societies in 1840, in which willing members would gather together and sign a pledge card pledging that they would abstain from alcohol consumption. And then in Portland, Maine, we have the first law that banned the production and sale of alcoholic beverages, known as the Maine Law in 1851, which was drafted by the mayor of Portland, Neal Dow. The Maine Law will become the first law against alcohol production and consumption that will become more popular statewide in other states. There's also a very strong diet and health movement in antebellum America, led by Sylvester Graham. Graham was particularly concerned about the American diet and health, and therefore he developed the graham cracker to alleviate particularly constipation. We also see an attention to prison reform and mental health reform with the efforts of Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix is the first woman to ever testify before a legislative committee before the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and she reveals the results of her findings, particularly in American prisons and insane asylums, that the mentally ill are often chained to walls in dark and dank rooms, subject to disease and just the worsening of their conditions. And often prisoners are forced to perform mundane and repetitive work, and there is no attention to rehabilitation in America. Thus, this sparks a new movement in prisons in 19th century America away from simple punishment and a move towards rehabilitation, rehabilitating criminals so that they can return to society. Another smaller reform movement in the 19th century was founded by William Ladd, which was known as the Peace Movement, which was an effort to abolish war throughout the world. The peace movement really reveals the idealism that is often characterized of 19th century antebellum reformers. There are many who believe that society has become so corrupt and really cannot be reformed and really needs to be restarted or that citizens need to isolate and remove themselves from society. This leads to a very large utopian movement in 19th century America. Utopianism emphasized abandoning society and creating small communal societies in which everything would be shared and partners would live in harmony away from the ravages of the city and the corruption of society. One of the earliest utopian societies was formed at Brook Farm, which is in West Roxbury, Massachusetts. But eventually, when a fire consumes one of the main barns, the community dissolves and departs. George Rapp, founder of the Rappites, another one of these more charismatic groups, religious groups that emerged in 19th century America, also created the Harmony Society in New Harmony, Indiana, which was a failed communal society. But the Scottish reformer Robert Owen, who after forming one utopian society in Scotland, comes to the United States and revives the community. This is a picture of the vision he hoped for to create in New Harmony, Indiana, of this ideal utopian society. Of course, all these structures were never constructed. And what often frequently happens in these communal societies is that members do not equally share the work or the results of their farming, and so disputes break out, and as a result, the societies dissolve. More famous and more controversial was the Oneida community created in upstate New York by John Humphrey Noyes. John Humphrey Noyes was also a religious revivalist, and in creating this utopian society, he emphasized creation of a new kingdom of God on earth, particularly where there would not be private marriage, but rather where all spouses were held in common, and which young men and young women were sexually initiated by older members of the group. And as a result, there are large numbers of children at the Oneida community, and was famous for the development of its Oneida silverware, but nevertheless earned the everlasting disdain of many of the neighbors. And the Oneida community becomes a byword as a place of sexual promiscuity and loose morals, and eventually is disbanded in the late 19th century. All of these reform movements are significant in antebellum America, but the most significant reform movement that eventually trumps all of the other movements and consumes the attention of the nation, of course, is the effort to abolish slavery in the United States. So to understand the effort to abolish slavery, we should examine the institution, which of course predominantly resided in the American South. We can see that a pivotal event in the expansion of slavery in the American South was Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin. The invention of the cotton gin enabled cotton to become a much more profitable crop. And as a result, the manual labor was needed to grow these large plantations of cotton, then to be picked and then processed through the cotton gin, and then packed for shipment. So as a result, along the deep South, what is often called the Black Belt for the dark, rich, fertile soil of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, large cotton plantations are formed, and we can see a commensurate expansion of slavery. Cotton becomes king in the South. As a result, the South is not a very diverse economy. It is heavily dependent upon cotton production and its requisite requirement of slave labor. So large plantations are developed throughout the South, particularly along coastal areas. The social classes of the South are heavily influenced by its economy. So as a result, we see an aristocratic class. This is a very small group in the American South that owns these plantations, large plantation houses, and may own dozens or hundreds of slaves to work their plantations. These are the super rich in the South, but are few, often resented by the yeoman farmers, which are a much larger group in the American South. An independent, self-sufficient farmer may have one or two slaves, very few though, certainly resentful of the great wealth of the large plantation owners. Beneath the yeoman farmers, we can identify another class of poor whites. These folks often certainly did not own any slaves, and rather lived on the margins of prosperity and are often living food to mouth, quite poor, and also resented the very rich plantation owners. To the mountains, particularly in what will become West Virginia, we can identify another group of mountain people, often nicknamed the hillbillies, who had no connection to the cotton plantations and cotton economy of the deeper South, and therefore are quite willing to join the North when the Civil War breaks out in 1861. There are some free Negroes in the South who are significant, but most free Negroes, of course, reside in the North. They may have been born in the South, particularly in slavery, but somehow had been manumitted or had escaped to the North. These include individuals like Solomon Northup, who was born in New York and who was actually a successful black businessman in New York, but is mistaken for an escaped slave on a trip to Washington, D.C., and is forced to serve on a Georgia plantation for a number of years before he secures his freedom. Jean-Baptiste Point de Sable, who is famous for the founding of the city of Chicago. Sojourner Truth, Richard Allen, the founder of the AME Church. Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave and becomes the most famous advocate, African-American advocate for the emancipation of the slaves, and Harriet Tubman as well, who is a famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. So thus slavery attracts the attention of so many in the North, because the Northern economy certainly is not dependent, like the Southern economy, upon the institution. One of the most egregious and horrific elements to American slavery is, of course, the slave market. The slave market is often a very violent and very sad scene in which families are ripped apart, where individuals are treated like cattle and assessed for their economic value, and then bought and sold as common pieces of property. There are many different types of slaves. There are, of course, field hands and domestic workers and dock workers. Also, there were mammies, in which there are household servants, particularly females, older females that would assist with childcare and domestic duties inside a large plantation house. And for recalcitrant slaves who were particularly obstinate, slave breakers would be hired by masters in which they would whip and break the will of disobedient slaves. The reform movement, particularly emerging in the North to abolish slavery, really develops over several different stages. The original argument for ending slavery focuses on colonization. We have the formation of the American Colonization Society in 1831, which was formed to repatriate American slaves back to Africa. So we see the founding of the colony of Liberia to be a place of liberty for Africans who had been living in slavery in the United States. And indeed, a couple hundred American slaves are repatriated to Liberia. But generally, the effort towards recolonization in Africa is deemed to be inefficient and ineffectual. Therefore, the movement for the abolition of slavery moves towards an argument of moral persuasion, to morally persuade the South that this is an evil institution. With the failure of those efforts, we see increased arguments towards gradualism, gradually emancipating slaves, perhaps when slaves reach the age of 18 or 25, or they had become senior citizens and therefore of less value, for them to be gradually emancipated. And then as we move towards particularly the 1840s and 1850s, we see the argument for emancipation move towards immediatism, which is the immediate emancipation, no more excuses, of African slaves. And then finally, of course, the solution that many strike upon for emancipating slaves is violence, either launching slave rebellions, such as that of John Brown at Harper's Ferry, or the violence of the Civil War, which will, of course, affect their emancipation with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and eventual ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. So the abolitionists that move this argument along and eventually conclude that immediatism or even violence are necessary for the emancipation of the slaves include famous abolitionists such as Elijah P. Lovejoy. Elijah P. Lovejoy was operating particularly in the state of Missouri and was a very vocal critic of local slaveholders. He has his printing press thrown into the local river several times, and eventually a mob attacks his house and warehouse in 1837, where he is shot in a window by a mob. Elijah P. Lovejoy is often considered the first abolitionist martyr to the cause of emancipating slaves. The Grimke sisters of New England were also famous advocates for women's suffrage, but eventually focused their efforts on the emancipation of slaves in their writings. William Lloyd Garrison was the most notable vocal member of the more radical abolitionists. Garrison, who is a native of Newburyport, Massachusetts, forms the paper The Liberator in 1831, in which he calls for the immediate emancipation of slaves, that he will be heard, that he wants no more excuses, and whatever it takes to see the emancipation of slaves needs to occur. Garrison will also be the target of much violence after making speeches, particularly in the Boston area, for his efforts. Theodore Dwight Weld, also another important abolitionist. His publication of American Slavery as It Is, The Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses, displayed the violence of the institution with first-hand accounts. Wendell Phillips was also a very famous New England abolitionist who was instrumental in the founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1831. The American Anti-Slavery Society also incorporated the efforts of the Tappan brothers, Lewis and Arthur, who were vocal critics of the institution. The most powerful voice for emancipation probably came from an African American himself, which of course was Frederick Douglass, who had grown up on a slave plantation and had moved to the North. And his publication of his autobiography, A Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, exposed the violence of slavery, the dehumanizing elements of the institution, and he becomes a confidant of President Abraham Lincoln and will see the emancipation of the slaves in 1863. David Walker was also another former slave and African American advocate for the emancipation of slaves. His Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World was a pivotal book because in this book he advocated not only for the emancipation of slaves but also for racial equality. That call for an equality between the black and white races was very rare, almost unheard of in early 19th century America. So as argument gives way to violence throughout the antebellum period, we see a series of slave rebellions across the antebellum period in which slaves themselves take up arms or are willing to conduct violence in order to secure their freedom. We see one of the first episodes of that in Virginia with Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800, which was a failure. Also, Denmark Vesey's Rebellion, which was plotted for 1822, but is betrayed and is foiled the night before the rebellion is to be launched. The most violent and somewhat successful rebellion is conducted by Nat Turner. Nat Turner's rebellion occurred also in Virginia in 1831, which led to the murder of several white plantation owners and required the Virginia militia to be called out to put down the rebellion, eventually leading to the death of Nat Turner himself. We also see a slave rebellion even on the high seas with the very famous Amistad Revolt. Aboard the Amistad, the slaves revolted, conducted a mutiny, and killed their Spanish and Portuguese masters and traders, took over control of the Amistad, eventually landing the ship on the banks of Long Island. The case for their freedom makes its way all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where eventually the court agrees that the slaves aboard the Amistad had earned their freedom and they are allowed to go free. Very important channel for the liberation of slaves in the American South is, of course, the Underground Railroad. This was a series of roads and caves and paths and swamps and creek crossings, significant cellars, barns where slaves could hide and make their journey north. If they are able to cross into Pennsylvania at the Mason-Dixon line or cross the Ohio River into Ohio, then they were able to secure their freedom, many of them going as far north all the way up to Canada, often protected by white station masters or protected in attics, secret locations in homes. Springboro, Ohio was one of the significant stops and safe havens along the way on the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman, of course, being the very famous conductor who multiple times returned to the South even after securing her own freedom in order to see other slaves gain their freedom as well. There is little discussion in the United States Senate for a number of years on the issue of slavery because the Senate votes in the gag rule. The gag rule prohibited the introduction of any resolutions in the United States Senate seeking the abolition or limiting of slavery. Thus, we see a refusal on the part of its members to even discuss the issue of abolishing slavery. So, with the Senate often bogged down by the gag rule and refusing to move forward on the issue, the only political solutions that are left are the formation of third parties, anti-slavery parties, including the Liberty Party in the 1840s, which nominates James Birney for the presidency. Generally, these parties are not successful, but they will at least continue the national conversation on political national solutions for the abolition of slavery. We also see the Free Soil Party, which runs a presidential candidate in 1848 and 1852, including Martin Van Buren, a former president. And we also see in the efforts of writers a new attention to the abolition of slavery. We see an explosion of American literature, uniquely American literature that was not heavily dependent on British and European styles in the antebellum period, including the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the novelist Herman Melville, whose most famous work was Moby Dick, John Greenleaf Whittier, who's a famous New England poet who wrote Snowbound, Walt Whitman, Louisa May Alcott, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and James Russell Lowell. Also, Americans developed their first major historian in George Bancroft, who was the Secretary of the Navy, instrumental in the founding of the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. Developed a new form of history that was very patriotic towards, very celebratory of American history, and also American words and American spellings with Noah Webster's publication of a new dictionary that got rid of longer English spellings of words. We also see a growing whaling industry, particularly centered around Nantucket and New Bedford, Massachusetts. Whaling is very important as the energy industry of the day. Whale oil is of great significance, not only for heating homes, but also for lanterns. And as a result, whaling crews departed from particularly Massachusetts into the Atlantic, but eventually all the way into the Pacific Ocean. The most famous whaling ship, of course, is the Essex, which was destroyed by a whale, resulting in castaways, and eventually the inspiration for Herman Melville's Moby Dick novel. This is a summary of some of the major reform movements and also religious revivals of the antebellum period. We now can move and talk more about national politics and how these revivals and reform movements intersect with political figures and national policy. So again, identifying this time period as the Age of Jackson from 1824 to 1844, very pivotal years because Andrew Jackson is often associated with them. He is the premier figure of the age, as was Jefferson during the first 24 years of this century. And even though Jackson is not president during all these years, he will serve as a two-term president. In 1824, there is a very significant election, very controversial election for the presidency in 1824. There are four candidates running: John Quincy Adams, who had been Secretary of State for James Monroe, who had been really the author of the Monroe Doctrine and also the Adams-Onis Treaty for the purchasing of Florida; William Crawford, a South Carolina politician; Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Creek War and also the Battle of New Orleans, and also instrumental in securing the purchase of Florida for the United States, as the hero of the West, the hero of many frontier settlers in the West. And also Henry Clay, the premier politician from the West, whose native Kentucky he was dearly beloved. As a result of the voting, it is clear that Andrew Jackson secured the majority of a large number of percentage of the popular vote at 43%, with John Quincy Adams coming in at 31%. But when the electoral returns are counted, it is clear that no candidate had a majority. Andrew Jackson had the most electoral votes, but he did not secure at least 51% of the electoral votes to secure his election. So as a result, whenever there's a confusion regarding the Electoral College, the vote is sent to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay, who is clear that he has not won the presidency, uses his large influence in the House of Representatives and his followers to turn their attention towards John Quincy Adams. Clay is afraid of Andrew Jackson as another figure from the West, and therefore Clay supposedly meets with John Quincy Adams. They have dinner together, and supposedly John Quincy Adams promised Henry Clay the position of Secretary of State, which was the traditional path towards the presidency, in return to Clay supporters supporting Adams for the presidency. As a result, when the vote occurs in the House of Representatives, Clay steers his supporters to vote for John Quincy Adams for the presidency, which Adams secures. A few days later, after Adams winning the vote, he names Henry Clay Secretary of State. This leads to charges of a corrupt bargain between Clay and Adams, and many of Jackson's followers, feeling that they had been deprived of the presidency and a victory for their individual, as the numbers seem to indicate. And so as a result of this very divided election in 1824, Jackson's large number of supporters feel gypped and cheated, and that the government is corrupt, and therefore they refuse to support the new president, John Quincy Adams. Adams, of course, is the son of his famous father, John Adams, who is a very important leader of the American Revolution. John Quincy Adams was born in Quincy, Massachusetts. He marries an English woman, Louisa Adams, who becomes First Lady of the United States. John Quincy Adams will only serve one term in the presidency. As a result of the corrupt bargain, his reputation in his presidency is really crippled from the outset. He is a leader of an emerging faction within the Democratic Republicans known as the National Republicans that really represent the old Federalist interests in the party. John Quincy Adams had many goals, including new federal funds for internal improvements, roads, canals, turnpikes, and also proposed a national university, a naval academy, and a national astronomical observatory. However, he is able to get very little done during his time in the White House because of the crippling influence of reputation of the corrupt bargain, and as a result of Jackson supporters who control Congress refusing to vote for any of his measures. What Jackson supporters in the Congress do vote for is a very high tariff, the Tariff of Abominations in 1828, which was really designed to be a trap for President Adams. It proposed and passed a 38% tax on most imported goods to the United States. As a result of raising the tariff, one of the highest in American history, the effort was to ensnare Adams that if he'd refused to sign the Tariff of Abominations, then he would alienate his base supporters in the North and their manufacturing interests. If he agreed to sign the tariff, which he does, then he would alienate particularly the South and the West, which was not overwhelmingly focused on manufacturers. So with the passage of the Tariff of Abominations, the South is particularly outraged, and Adams only secures his existing basis support in New England. And as a result, his presidency is crippled, and in 1828, Andrew Jackson defeats his re-election bid and is elected president in 1828. He will serve 2 terms from 1829 to 1837. Andrew Jackson, certainly one of the most charismatic presidents in American history, was born in South Carolina. His father died before when he was very young. And as a boy, Jackson had witnessed the British occupation of South Carolina, at one point refusing to polish a British officer's boots, which resulted in the officer slapping him on the side of his face with his saber and caused a deep scar on the side of his face he would carry for the rest of his life. Jackson was also famous for being involved in numerous duels, including famously shooting the best dueler of the West, Charles Dickinson, after an insult towards his wife. Jackson had secured an enormous national reputation for him, particularly through his military endeavors, including his victory in the Creek War and negotiation of the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which secured a lot of Georgian and Alabama lands for the United States, his victory at the Battle of New Orleans over the British, and also his role that he played in the seizure of Florida, leading to the Adams-Onis Treaty and the purchase of Florida. All these events lead to his growing national reputation. Jackson was a slaveholder and also a very wealthy man. He has his own plantation in what is today Nashville, Tennessee, known as the Hermitage, where he married Rachel Jackson. Rachel Jackson, who will be the target of many smears and attacks during the campaign, will die before Jackson's inauguration. So there, Jackson enters the White House as a grieving man upon Inauguration Day, and the efforts of his enemies to besmear his wife will carry him forth in anger through much of his administration. Nevertheless, there's many in the country, particularly Westerners, who are very excited that a common man, their military hero, not an Eastern aristocrat, has been elected to the presidency. And therefore, many Westerners descend on Washington, D.C. to witness Jackson's inauguration, and also descend on the White House in a famous event known as the Inaugural Brawl, in which these Westerners march into the White House eager to get their cup of punch and also to shake the hand of their hero. And the White House suffers enormous damage as a result of this brawl. Jackson will also be the target of the first presidential assassination attempt on January 30th, 1835, but a crazy man's would-be efforts to assassinate the president fail when both of his pistols fail to discharge, and the president himself attacks his would-be assassin with his cane. The presidency of Andrew Jackson is often identified as Jacksonian democracy, or a great age of democracy. This has to do with voting trends and procedures in the country, and actually very little with Andrew Jackson himself. We can recall that in the colonial period, in the 1600s, the qualifications for an individual to vote required that they be a white male who owned property and was a member in good standing of the local church, particularly in New England. With the First Amendment and the Constitution's abolition of an established religion, an established church in the United States, the requirement to be a member of the church falls off in all states, and thus white males who own property was the qualification in most states in order to vote. With the introduction of many other states and the incorporation of these Western states into the United States, and particularly with many of these Western states having large, available, often very cheap land, the property qualification makes less and less sense. And as a result, by the 1840s, 1850s, we see more people voting than ever before who do not own land and are not required to be a member of the church. So therefore, we can see the introduction of universal white male suffrage in the 1840s, 1850s, roughly about the same time as Jackson's presidency and the triumph of the Western common man. So as a result, on the eve of the Civil War, most white males throughout the country are enabled to vote without holding property or being a member of the church. Of course, the suffrage is expanded even later with the adoption of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery, thus at least free blacks in the North and free blacks in the South for a period of time during Reconstruction were able to vote. Women do not gain the right to vote until the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. And then, of course, we have a much greater expansion of suffrage in the United States today. So this period of Jackson's presidency is often equated as a great age of democracy, not only because of the expansion of universal male suffrage, but also the creation of nominating conventions in which a party convention would nominate the choice of the people to run for office, party platforms which specifically outlined what were the goals of a particular political party. And we see the Anti-Masonic Party, a very small Western party, as the forerunner of many of these ideas, the first to have a nominating convention and also a party platform. With the election of Andrew Jackson to the White House, Western common frontiersmen believe that they have their own hero in the White House, and thus their president rewards their efforts in what becomes known as the spoils system. The spoils system is based on the idea that to the victor goes the spoils, and thus, because Jackson and his supporters won the White House, they are enabled to appoint any of their supporters to key government positions. This is, of course, favorable to Jackson and his re-election efforts, but it often later on is going to lead to widespread corruption and incompetence in government civil service. The spoils system will not be reformed until the Gilded Age with the passage of the Pendleton Act and the introduction of civil service exams. Jackson, although he does have an official cabinet, preferred a smaller group of advisors, which were allegedly meeting in the kitchen of the White House and become nicknamed the Kitchen Cabinet. These advisors, including Martin Van Buren, become the prime advisors of the president beyond his own cabinet. Jackson demonstrated a distaste for his own cabinet, particularly stemming from the Petticoat Affair. The Petticoat Affair ensues when John Eaton's first wife dies and he marries a much younger Peggy O'Neill. As a result, the vice president's wife, Floride Calhoun, is very critical of this union and draws in her husband, John C. Calhoun, the vice president of the United States, to criticize John and Peggy O'Neill. Jackson, who had witnessed smears against his own wife and his own marriage, as a result, is outraged and fires everyone in the cabinet except Secretary of War John Eaton. So thus, the Petticoat Affair reveals Jackson's favor that he gives to reform and his aversion he has to traditional government officials. Now, in response to the Tariff of Abominations, which had been passed during John Quincy Adams' presidency, the South is outraged. The South, particularly as an agriculturally focused economy, was very much punished by the introduction of a large tariff. Many of the manufactured goods that the South purchased originated from Britain and from Europe. The tariff, of course, as a tax on imports, would raise the price of those goods. So as a result, a pair of shoes in 1828 from Britain would cost about $1.25. After the Tariff of Abominations, that same pair of shoes would be $1.75. But of course, the pair of American shoes, which the tariff was designed to promote the purchase of American goods, would be the same price. So as a result, the South, particularly South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, feels like the tariff unfairly punishes one region of the country. Calhoun points out this economic discrepancy in the publication of his pamphlet, South Carolina Exposition and Protest, in which he exposes the unnecessary punishment of one region of the country by the tariff, but also proposes a very dangerous solution, which is the doctrine of nullification. Nullification is the idea that a state, if it does not prefer a federal law, can nullify it, make it null and void in its own state. This is an idea that originated with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions drafted by Jefferson and Madison in response to the Alien Sedition Acts during John Quincy Adams' presidency. And now this idea of nullification is introduced A convention is held in South Carolina, and indeed, the convention nullifies, makes null and void the tariff abominations for South Carolina and its ports. This political cartoon is certainly critical of the idea of nullification, which the nullification and its resulting South Carolina ordinance will eventually lead to treason, civil war, deception, disunion, and despotism. Thus, a conflict is set up between South Carolina and its most famous senator in John C. Calhoun and the president himself, Andrew Jackson, who opposes nullification. This conflict is evidenced at Jefferson's birthday dinner in 1830 to commemorate the famous third president of the United States, in which Andrew Jackson toasts the others in the room, including John C. Calhoun, and looking directly at his vice president Calhoun, declares, "Our union, it must be preserved." In other words, rejecting the idea of nullification. And across the room, a very scared and shaking John C. Calhoun raises his glass and declares, "The Union, next to our liberty, most dear," thus defending his idea of nullification. Jackson responds by introducing a bill that Congress passes and eventually signs, known as the Force Bill. The Force Bill mandated that the government and the president could reinforce key forts and call up militia, possibly for an invasion of South Carolina, and the federal government forcibly enforcing the collection of the tariff at South Carolina ports. This, of course, scares residents of South Carolina immensely, and it appears that the Civil War is about to break out in the early 1830s as a result of conflict over the tariff and the nullification crisis. Into this conflict steps Henry Clay. He proposes his second significant compromise of the antebellum period, the first being the Missouri Compromise. This is the Compromise Tariff of 1833, in which Clay did not want to see Jackson score another triumph, and as Clay is looking forward to a presidential campaign in 1832. As a result, Clay proposes that the tariff duties would be reduced by 10% over the next 8 years. The tariff would gradually be reduced so that the levy would be reduced to 25% in 1842. As a result, during that time, northern manufacturing would become more competitive over the 8 years, and conflict would be avoided. South Carolina, looking for a way out of the impasse, submits and agrees to the compromise tariff of 1833, but not before, in a ceremonial and insulting gesture, nullifies the Force Bill. So thus, conflict, which is starting to emerge, particularly connected to issues of slavery and the Southern economy, emerged in the 1830s, almost breaking out into conflict. As a result of the Compromise of Tariff of 1833, the tariff is indeed gradually reduced. Now, Andrew Jackson had a reputation throughout his career as being a famous Indian fighter. And there is an emerging issue, particularly with the remaining tribes in areas of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia that refuse to sell their ancestral lands to white settlers. Often whites encroach on these lands and the Indians resist, and it leads to violence. Tribal officials refuse numerous offers by settlers for the sale of these lands. As a result, the representatives of the Indian tribes sue for their rights, and their case makes it all the way up to the Supreme Court. There, Chief Justice John Marshall, still presiding as Chief Justice, declares in two pivotal decisions that the Cherokees are domestic dependent nations of the federal government. And in a very significant case, Worcester v. Georgia of 1832, Georgia state law has no jurisdiction over the Cherokee lands. Thus, the state of Georgia cannot mandate that the Cherokees sell their lands, particularly through the claim of eminent domain. Now, Jackson is furious at this, and as a result proclaims Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it, which, of course, the enforcement of laws is the president's responsibility and not that of the Chief Justice. And so, as a result, many minor tribal officials who really did not represent the tribe as a collective unit sign backroom deals with white settlers for the sale of these lands. Now that white settlers have a document in their hands indicating that some Indian representative had signed it and had sold their lands, they demand the removal of these Indians. So therefore, Congress passes and Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act, which results in the Trail of Tears, this large migration of several thousand Indians from the American Southeast to what was at that time known as Indian Territory, later to be redesignated Oklahoma. So as a result, several counties in the state of Oklahoma have the names of these Indian tribes that were forcibly removed in the Trail of Tears, stemming from the Indian Removal Act of the 1830s, including the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw. The other significant conflict in Jackson's presidency stemmed from the Second Bank of the United States. You remember that a central federal bank was first initiated and created by Alexander Hamilton, first Secretary of the Treasury. That first Bank of the United States was formed in 1791. It had a 20-year charter and lasted till 1811. The bank was not rechartered until after the War of 1812 to resolve a lot of the financial issues stemming from the War of 1812. And so a new bank was chartered by the Democratic Republicans in 1816, another 20-year charter, which was supposed to last until 1836. Now, you recall that the role of the National Bank as a central banking institution was to regulate the nation's finances and the money supply of the country. Thus, customs houses and its key ports along the Atlantic coast would collect tariffs, turnpikes, also liquor taxes, and that money would be deposited into the Bank of the United States. The bank also ensured that smaller state and regional and private banks, particularly in the West, often had enough specie, hard money, gold or silver, in that they can print notes, issue mortgages, and produce their own paper money. Without that supervision, these smaller pet banks, sometimes called wildcat banks, would randomly and recklessly print a whole bunch of paper money to ensure economic transactions in the West, but of course the money wasn't worth anything, and it could lead to instability in the financial sector, which was used by these farmers, particularly in the West. The very much hated president of the National Bank was Nicholas Biddle. Biddle had the reputation of being an Eastern aristocrat who represented Eastern banking interests more than the interests of the common man and the Western farmer. His nickname, the divisive nickname, was Tsar Nicholas. And he was known for granting generous loans to congressmen and business leaders, those that would be in a position to vote for the bank's protection and continuance, and curbed reckless spending and loans, particularly in the American West. Now, in 1832, as Jackson is looking to be re-elected president, Henry Clay, one of his biggest critics in the United States Congress, in the Senate, decides to run for the presidency himself. Clay believes that he can set up a trap for Jackson, just as the Jacksonians had set up a trap for John Quincy Adams in the Tariff Abominations in the election of 1828. Clay's plan stems from issuing a recharter bill early for the bank in 1832. Even though the National Bank was supposed to exist all the way until 1836, Clay believes by bringing up a recharter early, knowing that Jackson hated the bank, that Jackson would veto the recharter bill, it would be politically unpopular, and it would ensure Clay's election to the presidency. Thus, bringing up this recharter bill, Clay has Congress pass it and eventually is sent to the president's desk. And predictably, Jackson vetoes the bill for the recharter. In the veto message, vetoing the recharter of the National Bank, Jackson calls it a moneyed monster and explains and shows how it was very crippling towards the interests of the common man, particularly Western farmers. Now, Clay believes that he has secured the election victory, the campaign victory he will need to ensure his election to the presidency. As a result, Clay himself has 30,000 copies of Jackson's veto message printed and distributed throughout the country. The bank itself contributes $50,000 to Clay's re-election campaign. Common people read Jackson's recharter bill, and in direct irony from Clay's efforts, they agree with Jackson and believe that the bank should not be rechartered and be destroyed. So thus, Clay's efforts to secure his own election actually helped Jackson's re-election efforts, and as a result, in 1832, Jackson wins a very significant victory, securing 219 of the electoral votes and 55% of the popular vote. Now that his re-election is secured, Jackson believes he has secured a mandate for destroying the bank. Instead of letting it lie low and exist for its remaining 4 years on its charter, Jackson decides to remove all the federal deposits out of the national bank. And of course, a bank without deposits is really no bank at all and is very weak. Jackson takes all those federal deposits, moves it out of the national bank, and as a result, sends them to smaller pet banks. Thus, we can see this chart of how the nation's money supply works, that those same tariff revenues, turnpike tolls, and liquor taxes that were originally put in the national bank are now put in smaller pet banks. There is no national banking institution to supervise these banks. Therefore, they recklessly print much paper money that is not backed up by hard money, gold or silver, any type of specie. They're issuing mortgages and promissory notes, all type of different loans that they do not have the deposits to guarantee. As a result, Western farmers take this easy money and these easy loans, and there is massive land speculation, a real estate bubble, particularly in the American West, in which Western land sales go from $2 million in 1830 to $24 million just 6 years later. So as a result, farmers in the West are overextended with large loans purchased with faulty mortgages or bad paper money to buy land and seed and fertilizer and plows and to build barns and so forth. And gradually, President Jackson realizes these notes, these mortgages, this paper money in the West isn't worth much. So he issues the Specie Circular, an executive order that requires Western farmers to pay for their purchases and pay back their loans in the form of gold and reestablish security for the nation's finances. Well, of course, Western farmers have very little gold on them. Jackson retires from the presidency in 1837. His vice president is elected in 1836, Martin Van Buren, and Van Buren inherits a massive economic collapse, the greatest economic depression the United States had seen to that point, with the Panic of 1837. Farmers, particularly in the West, default on their mortgages. Their paper currency is worth nothing. It is also stems from a British recession. There's also a series of bad harvests, and so there's a deep, very severe Panic of 1837 with many banks failing, factories closing, land sales decline, and all new public works projects, including canals and road construction, dry up. In response to the economic collapse, a new political party is formed known as the Whig Party. The Whig Party is essentially an anti-Jackson party. It stems from the traditional Whig Party from England, which opposed the power of the king. Jackson is accused of ruling as an autocrat, as a monarch, often designated King Andrew I. And so the Whig Party, which is very much an anti-Jackson party, protests the abuses of executive power, opposed Jackson's bank war, supported Clay's American system, supported a protective tariff, a national bank, the restoration of a national bank. They're supported particularly by evangelicals and reformers, wealthy lawyers and merchants. And it is clear that the issue of slavery is really beginning to threaten both the Democrats that support Andrew Jackson and the Whigs that will support their candidate in 1840, William Henry Harrison. Harrison was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811 and the destruction of Tecumseh's Confederacy in the Ohio River Valley, a hero of the War of 1812. And he runs what is called the Log Cabin Campaign in 1840. In many ways, the Whigs in 1840 learned from Jackson's campaign that they nominate a Western hero, a hero of the common man, and use this archetypical structure as a centerpiece of their campaign, the log cabin. That Harrison is a common man, and as a common man, he will protect the interests of the common man if elected to the White House. A very famous campaign slogan from 1840 is Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tippecanoe, of course, referring to the presidential candidate William Henry Harrison, who won the Battle of Tippecanoe, and John Tyler, his running mate from Virginia, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Large campaign rallies occurred at log cabins with log cabin symbolism, but also the free distribution of whiskey, much of which was developed by a Philadelphian distiller named E.G. Booze. Therefore, we have the nickname of alcohol becoming nicknamed as booze. And as a result, particularly because of the Panic of 1837, Martin Van Buren is soundly defeated in the campaign of 1840, with Harrison winning 80% of the electoral vote and 53% of the popular vote. William Henry Harrison inherits a significant economic crisis when he ascends to the presidency in 1841, but he will not last long. He will have the shortest presidency in American history as he delivers a 2-hour inaugural address in the rain in March of 1841, rides back to the White House without his hat on, contracts pneumonia, and will die just a few weeks into his presidency on April 4th, 1841. Thus, his vice presidential candidate, John Tyler, very much a man unlike Harrison, a Virginia aristocrat, will fill the rest of Harrison's years in the White House from 1841 to 1845. Tyler's presidency is marked by indecision and accomplishing little. He actually alienates all the members of his own party. He's known as the man without a party because Jackson's Democrats don't support him. And because of his firing of many members of his cabinet, his own Whig party does not support him. The president is almost killed in a disastrous explosion aboard the USS Princeton in 1844. But there's very little significance to his presidency during those years from 1841 to 1845. John Tyler does have the distinction of being the earliest president of the United States to still have living grandchildren, with 2 of his grandchildren still living in Virginia taking care of his estate, as Jackson married multiple times, including fathering children into his 60s, and then his child fathered children late in life as well. And as a result, he is the earliest president still to have living grandchildren.